Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our May 2024 pick for the Kanopy Cinema Series. Sorry for starting a little bit late today, but we are waiting for a few people to come in. But as we get started, maybe you can let us know that you're here by letting us know where you're coming from in the chat. I'm in Chicago, Illinois, and it's beautiful and sunny, and it's great to see everybody. We're going to give everybody about another 30 seconds right now to see to let everybody come in, and then we will get started. All right. And I'm going to do, since we're running a little behind, I'm going to get a little, we've got some people from Cleveland. Hello from Cleveland. We've got a couple of people from Cleveland, some from Indiana as well, from Mundane, Illinois. Hello, everybody. So we are, I'm just going to go through the housekeeping a little bit to let everybody know. We do have the Q&A box for typing in questions for the panelists that we have today. So the audience, we do have an audience upvote feature, so we will be paying attention to that, but we'll be basically saving most of the questions until the end. And then if there is something that seems particularly relevant that's been upvoted, we'll maybe interject and see if we can ask that question within the context of the conversation. Also, we do have the chat box enabled, so if you just kind of want to mention something, just post something. It's out there. We found it really helpful if you want to talk with colleagues or people that you know that might be attending as well, just to really kind of banter a bit. As long as it's not too distracting, we do invite you to do that. We find that there's a nice camaraderie involved in that. And then I do want to, of course, introduce everybody here. I'd like you to meet the speakers. Of course, we have the Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who is the main subject of the documentary. She is the economics professor at Stony Brook University. She's also the former chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee. We also have Marin Poitras, who is the director of the documentary. So we're so pleased to have you on board today. And then we do have our moderator, David Jennings, who works for us here at Kanopy and Overdrive. I am Josh Garcia, the manager for Kanopy Marketing, and I'm so glad that you're here today. I'm going to actually turn it over after I let everybody know about this Kanopy Cinema Series. This is the final one of a series of Q&As that we ask directors and subjects of our films that we're releasing. And we've had a couple of great ones this spring. This is the last one we have for 2024. It's Finding the Money, of course, which explores MMT and asks us to rethink the national debt and the nature of money. So we are allowing all academic users with their student ID to actually watch this for free between now and Friday. But you could also, of course, watch it on Kanopy with any type of library card you have, free and no cost to you as the end user. We will let people know about titles in June, our fall titles in June, to let people know what we have lined up and slated for this upcoming semester. So we're really excited. We have a lot of really cool films that we think that would be really helpful for people and actually really compelling just to watch. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And then lastly, if you do want to find out a little bit more about our cinema series and the films that we've featured in the past and maybe watch recordings, you can go to lib.kanopy.com/cinema series. You can learn more, and we will keep everybody updated about our fall 2024 plans as well. All right, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to David, who's going to moderate our discussion with Dr. Stephanie Kelton and Director Marin Poitras. And I'm going to hand it off to you and let you get started.
Thank you, Josh, and Marin and Dr. Kelton, thank you for being here today. I'm just going to kind of jump in with my first question, and it is for Marin. And my first question is, how did you hear about modern monetary theory, or MMT, and how did you learn about Dr. Stephanie Kelton? And also, what was the first steps that you took to connect?
Yeah, so my background is more in environmental studies and climate, and so that is what drew me eventually into this story. But because I think we often come up against kind of the economy or economics or the how are you going to pay for it question when we're thinking about how can we tackle some of our bigger societal problems like climate change or inequality or any other problem, that you really care about. And so it was a very circuitous route that led me eventually to this small group called MMT or Modern Monetary Theorists. And so it was just a lot of reading, me just doing a lot of reading. And then eventually, I reached out when I saw, I'm sitting there reading and seeing like the conflict and the controversy play out on social media or within these articles back and forth. And I found it to be dramatic and I found it to be really intriguing. Could it be true that like this small group, what they're saying when they're questioning kind of some of the very basic foundational assumptions of mainstream economics, could it be that this small group is right and raising some important questions? And so, yeah, I wanted to see for myself. So I did eventually, reach out and went to kind of a conference where a lot of them were. So that's where I met folks at first, was at this first conference I attended in 2018, right across the street from where I am right now. But yeah, we're just here together. We've got one more screening tonight in New York. So we'll do a Q&A shortly in a few hours here. But yeah, so it's been great. But it was definitely a journey, a long journey of trying to sort this out and then eventually start talking to MMT economists and talking to mainstream economists and figuring out where my thoughts lied.
In regards to that kind of process, what was the reception to yourself as someone who wanted to make a documentary film about it in that type of environment?
Yeah, well, I think the MMT economists were always very open. I think, they have gone through, right, that stage of being ignored and ridiculed, and they're just kind of trying to share what they've come up with anyone who will talk, and I was kind of documenting that process where they were starting to gain a lot of traction, or especially right around early 2019 when I started filming, they really gained a lot of media attention because this was right around the time when AOC introduced the Green New Deal and she mentioned the word MMT, and then the mainstream media really latched onto it. So Stephanie at the time was just doing tons of interviews with journalists and others and just sharing with whoever, was interested. And so I was one of those people just trying to get time and follow a little bit of the story as it was progressing in real time.
Okay. My next question is for Dr. Kelton. When Marin first reached out to you and kind of proposed her initial thoughts on making this documentary, what was your reaction, and did you have any hesitance or apprehension to kind of going along with it?
I don't remember the first time that she reached out. I just remember at some point, Marin appearing and miking me up and wanting to do kind of more. I didn't know, honestly, what she was up to. And I didn't know, and I don't think she knew, going in, how it was all going to unfold in her own mind. And I certainly did not think that I was central to the story. I thought that I was just one of many people that she was talking to. And then at some point, it became clearer and clearer in my mind that I felt like I was playing a more central role than I envisioned. And I think I didn't entirely feel comfortable with that. And so she had a harder time connecting with me because I sort of backed up a little bit because I didn't know how everyone else would feel about that in some ways. And so I don't know. We eventually decided that we were going to move forward and I would just participate as fully as I could. And so, it became, I think, a terrific film, but it wasn't the film that I thought she initially set out to make. And so it was a surprise to me.
Marin, how did you build that trust with Dr. Kelton in that process to be able to kind of make her the center of the documentary and keep going while you're making this?
Well, yeah, I think, yeah, that's a big part of it. And, maybe it's not until you actually see the final film that that you can really know what it is. So, so I think it was more, she just had to put blind trust, in someone. And so, but I think also it helps if you don't really feel like you have something you're trying to hide or, I think it was, she just is talking to any journalist out there, and I'm just another one of those. And so it happens to be this one is quite a bit focused on this story in depth. And so and you know, it's true. Yeah, I didn't know exactly how to put the pieces of this puzzle together, how it's going to end up, and you know, the voices that are needed to really tell the story and engage with audiences. And so I think, you know, Stephanie was so important to feature in the film, so to really hold the audience's hand, you know, and help take them along in this journey and have someone you can connect with or communicate with. And so, yeah, that's just why it's important to have, but it's important to show, you know, it is such a group effort as well. And Stephanie will always say that, you know, it's certainly not just her, there's a whole, you know, group behind it. And you know, an evolution of these ideas still today. So I think, yeah, it is just a matter of going out there and hoping, yeah, hoping for the best, and then just keep pushing and even, yeah, and just trying to get time to make it happen.
Maren, is this, I believe this is your first documentary like that you've directed, is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In that regard, what challenges did you face as a first-time director? And overall, how long did the production take?
Yeah, so it was about 5 years. So plenty of challenges, you know, especially from starting filming in early 2019, you know, it doesn't really count the time reading ahead of time, which was a lot. And then, you know, the pandemic started. So I think I got most lucky to get most of my shooting done right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic came and, you know, more questions and trying to start editing, trying to just start fundraising. And so there's that whole process, but every bit of the process is a huge challenge, like enormous. Yeah. And it kind of just got harder the further and further you went. So yeah, the editing was a huge challenge because it's a complex topic, and really there's so much you want to include. So I struggled the most with what to cut and what to include, and because I do still feel like it's missing a lot. And so there's plenty of room for this discussion on the subject, and it's good we have Q&As where we have a chance to dive into those. And so I'm glad, you know, I hope professors and students can take this on board as, you know, in their classes, so you can really dive into the many different directions you can go in many different subject categories, you know, not just economics, but of course public policy and law, or anthropology, or history, or sociology. It's kind of ecology, climate, you know, you name it, it kind of touches so much. And so that's what I think is really fascinating about the story, and hope that it can continue to evolve and you know, engage these discussions in different ways.
And in regards to like the logistics of obtaining different people, in addition to Dr. Kelton, to be interviewed on the subject matter, how did that go about? How did you select who was going to be in the film and talk about their viewpoint and some other ideas as well?
Yeah, so it's definitely important for me to just get as broad a viewpoint base as I could, or especially trying to examine the critiques of MMT and find, you know, because a big question I think for audience members and for myself going into the film was, you know, what's really going on here? What's the core of the conflict? Why is there so much controversy? Because, you know, this small group is saying that the mainstream may be skipping over certain assumptions or missing certain assumptions that the whole then field is built upon. And so I wanted to talk to a broad range of those mainstream economists, you know, from the left to the right, who do have critiques of MMT, or they say, don't listen to those people, you know, they're crazy, or that's a crackpot theory, or they're wrong. But I could never find, you know, so I just am searching and searching, okay, well, where does MMT go wrong? You know, I'm just looking for a good critique, a solid critique, and show me this is what they say and this is why it's wrong. But the best I could find, you know, were people just saying, oh, MMT says this and that's wrong, or that, you know, MMT says you can print infinite amounts of money and never get inflation. Well, that's wrong. Well, it's also not what MMT says, and so it's not a valid critique in that way if you're not critiquing what the theory actually says. So I could never quite find someone who grappled with the subject matter enough to have a good critique. So that told me something. You know, I did probably George Selgin is the person I put in there from the Cato Institute who had grappled with the material enough, I think, to have a valid critique. And what was interesting there, of course, is that he actually validated that he felt MMT did have an accurate description of how the current monetary system operates, and yet he had some critique around, you know, well, what is our real resource capacity now, and what can we afford in terms of real resources? But that, of course, I think is exactly where the debate should be moving and what we should be debating is what is our real resource capacity. So, that was all very educational, very interesting for me because, I was very open and ready to be convinced otherwise, to be convinced that MMT was wrong. But I couldn't be convinced, and they've, I think, been waiting for 30 years for someone to come along. Stephanie herself started skeptical. I mean, everyone who comes across this theory starts out skeptical, right? But then you hear story after story of, well, they can't prove it wrong, so they have to end up eventually kind of, adopting that this is an accurate description of simply how our system works today, and I've always felt like that should be verifiable. If it's created by men and written in our books of law, then we should be able to verify this is how our monetary system works. So I had all these questions, and I of course really wanted to ask the economists, had they grappled with these questions? And I think the biggest answer I got was they hadn't grappled yet with those basic fundamental questions of just, is the federal government the issuer of the currency or not, at that basic of a level.
My next question is for Dr. Kelton. So MMT, at least from my perspective, seems to kind of go against what I was taught in school and what I grew up to know or thought I knew about money and how the national debt works. In regards to educating and advocating, what reservations do you have when you first started advocating for MMT, and what is your motivation to continue to educate and share this with others?
Well, my motivation, I'll take the second part of the question first. So I'm a teacher, right? I'm an educator. So I think it's almost in my DNA. My mother was a teacher. I want to help people understand things, and especially something that is as important and intrusive as questions about what governments, the capacity of the state, what governments can afford to do for their people. Can we make investments in critical infrastructure, in health, in education, in climate resilience, and all the rest of it? And like Maren started off saying, that question that becomes the hurdle to every conversation is the how are you going to pay for it question. And well, what about the deficit? And what about the debt to GDP? And what about a CBO report? What about? There are good answers to all of those questions that are not the answers that are normally given. And because I feel like I can supply a different and better answer that advances the debate, that we can get, it would put us in a better place nationally to have a more productive, fruitful debate about national priorities, what we can afford, how to manage resources, So I feel as an economist an obligation to offer honest descriptions and explanations for how the economy works, and in particular the monetary system and the role that it plays in facilitating the spending that we might like to see in one or some combination of these areas. I don't think I ever felt hesitant about speaking about this. I mean, there's something in the film, you hear a New York Times columnist, Peter Coy, say, there's almost something, you're just not supposed to look too closely or think too much about money. You're just supposed to, and it is strangely kind of a taboo. You don't ask questions about the monetary system. I mean, John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist, said the process by which money is created is so simple, the mind is repelled. Well, if money is a repellent, that's a problem. There are people who will try to stay away from that subject, but I was just never one. I studied accounting and finance as an undergrad, so I like to talk about financial plumbing and money, and so I didn't want to shy away from those questions.
Do you feel there are any reasons why it is the way it is, and why it is taboo in our society?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a blog for New Economic Perspectives. It had to be at least 10 years ago. And I started the blog with a knock knock joke, like knock knock, who's there, money, and then a scream, like a screaming face, because there is something unsettling about the idea that this institution that is central to our whole economy, money, right? That it's something that we just made up and we can upgrade it, we can change it, we can scrap old monies and invent new ones like the euro. And, you know, they just, you talk about how banks make loans, and it's, you hear people say out of thin air, and it starts to feel unnerving that you're not living in a world that is tethered, that is anchored by something real and a fiat currency. I mean, you probably see this, you know, if you follow people who are really hardcore crypto enthusiasts or something.
Yeah.
They thrive on that unsettling nature of a fiat currency, and they sort of capitalize on the fact that people don't understand it, that it does make people kind of fearful, and they create a narrative that says this is why you should be investing in Bitcoin or whatever, you know. So you have to just deal with it. It's a fiat, right? We're not on a gold standard anymore. We made the break, and now we have to wrestle with what it really means to have a free floating currency that we get to decide how to use.
My next question is for both of you. Maren, you mentioned that it was over 5 years making the documentary. How do you keep the momentum going in that time? Dr. Kelton, how do you stay, you know, committed to working with the project? Do you see footage as it's being edited, or how's that process work over that long period of time with the making of the documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, yeah, I mean, just on my end, you know, it's just a slog of getting through it, and the editing taking a really long time, and computers being too slow, and yeah, needing things. And I had to get, you know, I reached out to other different consulting editors and worked with different editors to just keep this story going and but it just takes hours and hours to get the edit right. I mean, there's just no way around putting in the hours, I think. And of course I was learning a lot as I went, so that I think was a lot slower for me, but you just have to keep pushing. You have to be fairly obsessed with the subject, although of course by the end it's maybe not your favorite anymore, but yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I was probably going dark for a long time. I think a lot of MMT people I had spoke, you know, they thought, this film will probably never get done. You know, I think they probably mostly assumed it wouldn't get done. Or they hadn't heard from me in a long time because I'm just editing. So, you know, it's like once I shoot, then it's just editing, and didn't see a cut until it was just about done, I think. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it was just about done. I think some of the animations were rough, and there was some opportunity for us to go back and forth a little bit. But yeah, by the time I saw what she'd been up to for all that time, it was pretty nearly complete.
Maren, I have another question. So when you were making the documentary and doing research, were there any surprising discoveries or revelations that emerged during your research or while interviewing individuals? And did that kind of change the narrative or the direction that you were going in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely little bits, and I was always learning the details along the way. You know, there's so much nuance to it. So there's, you know, you do have to, the wording is important and framing is important. And so I was, you know, learning a lot of that as I went, but also, you know, just, it was more, the harder part was figuring out how to tell the story and the order to tell the story and to keep the audience engaged. I think that was probably the hardest parts for me. And then, you know, but I think probably for me, the most educational parts were going out and talking to more mainstream economists and just trying to figure out that conflict and controversy and understand in my mind how that controversy can exist, or, you know, just kind of seeing maybe how economists or mainstream economists are able to hold, you know, two contradictory ideas in their minds at the same time, and how that can kind of propel, or just how these stories can be written in textbooks and just kind of perpetuate. And if you're not taught it in the textbooks, it's very hard to question it. And just learning more and more how, yeah, just kind of how strict the field of economics might be to that outside questioning. I think, you know, there are a lot of heterodox fields of economics that exist that kind of have their own critiques of the mainstream from different angles, which maybe says something as well. So there are critiques coming from different angles, but they're able to kind of keep pushing forward with their current textbooks. And so my biggest question will be, you know, will this get integrated into the mainstream, or how will that kind of happen and those contradictions be resolved? I think that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah. Dr. Kelton, when you saw the film, the full cut for the first time, What was your initial reaction?
Well, I mean, like at the Woodstock Film Festival, I mean, that's where I saw the full film as it pretty much as it exists today. I mean, I think my first thing I said when we all kind of went up to the front of the theater for the audience interaction part was just that you killed it, I think is what I said. I think the audience felt that, and I felt that way too. I mean, it is not easy to make a movie about, wonky, heady, lofty subject like this and deficits and national debt, and do it in a way that keeps the audience engaged throughout and even laughing periodically. And, you get to the end and people just feel empowered, and you can sense that when you're with them. And so, yeah, I think that my comment to her was, you really crushed it. Yeah.
Maren, what was your feelings leading up to the premiere, and once it did premiere, how did you feel and what did you think? How was that experience?
I guess, yeah, it's just been a lot of relief. And I think it has been, it is very nice. Like the in-person screenings are very nice because people are very nice in person, unlike maybe online. So, so in-person people are very, just the feedback has been very affirming and just very rewarding. So I really appreciate that. And, years of hard work, and I still question it. I still question, why didn't I put this in or that in? But the audiences are nice. So I'll just go with that. Just stay off of social media.
Yes, good advice for all of us. And as someone myself with a film background, I'm curious, how many hours of footage did you shoot for this documentary?
Well, that's a good question. I never actually added it up, so I really don't know. I don't think, yeah, there were some long interviews, like I think Randall Ray's interview was maybe 4 hours where he sat there but so it's a lot of, just interviews, interview footage, but not a ton, it wasn't like a verite film where you have just tons of footage. I feel like I had just enough to piece together the film, even though, yeah, although there's a lot missing still. So there's a lot of there's a lot of great stuff on the cutting room floor, like great sound bites and stuff I would have loved to include. But yeah, I always told myself I'd put out these extra scenes and maybe one day I will, but it's hard. So we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Kelton, as an ordinary citizen such as myself and others who are here today, what can I do to either help change the narrative about how our monetary system works, or try to make some kind of impact, like where we spend our money or where, our government spends its money, such as, healthcare for all or preventing climate change? Like, what can I do as an audience member?
Well, there's a lot, right? This is one perfect example, having this film available through Kanopy and teaching other people, using it as an instrument to educate is a hugely valuable service. People do things big and small. I mean, it's been incredible, watching people describe it as a movement. And I don't know another economic school of thought really that has a quote movement behind it, but we really do. And it developed very organically over many, many years. It's international. There are people all over the world who started their own newsletters and podcasts and YouTube channels. There are people who, make sure that when they read something in the New York Times or the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal that they think is, getting the Social Security debate or the debt ceiling or whatever it is wrong, they'll come in with a letter to the editor. And, little things like that, calling into a radio show with a different perspective, leaving a comment on in the comment section of the New York Times for other people to run into with some links attached so that people can discover a different way of thinking. I mean, like I said, ways big and small, but just leaning in any way at all is really helpful because it's where the momentum, how we sustain the momentum.
This is a question for both of you. I've personally seen the national debt counter myself and what my family shares in real life. And after watching this film, I can say that my perspective on that has changed. and I can sleep a little easier at night. But aside from myself, what impact do you think, or what you hoped this film will have on its audience, and what will come from it?
Well, I guess I could start briefly. I mean, I think, and the reason I made the film was, yeah, just to change our perspective on so much of, what we care about politically, right? So I think it still kind of comes down to, we still have to take action, but hopefully we can have that better debate or a different political debate around what we want to prioritize and what we can maybe afford in different ways. And so of course we still have to budget, we still have to prioritize, but we see money more as the organizing tool rather than the scarce resource that we need to budget. So money is really, what's interesting and for me is to think about, what kind of government spending can we afford today that, maybe costs a lot of dollars, but doesn't take a lot of resources. So something like hiring people who are unemployed to do ecological restoration, or, protect a forest, or prevent wildfires, or, fisheries. So all these kind of things that, we're told we can't do, especially on the environmental or climate side, because maybe they take some dollars, but they're saving us so many resources. So those things in a different calculus all of a sudden become much more affordable. If we have this different framework of how are we budgeting and what can the government afford, what's affordable. And so I would love to see the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, kind of change their model in terms of how they score any new spending proposal. Instead of saying just how many dollars will it add to the deficit or the debt, which doesn't tell us a whole lot, how we need to analyze that legislation for any inflationary potential. And that, of course, is also connected to real resources. So do we have the real resources to afford this spending? And if not, how could we make them more available, build capacity, or think about pushing down spending or use of those resources in the private sector? So, we analyze public spending for its inflationary potential or resources, but maybe we should also be thinking about private sector spending on, fossil fuel infrastructure and these sorts of things. Maybe that should still fall under the rubric of, does it serve the public interest, and does it, or does it cause inflation and other harmful costs to the rest of society? Include that different calculus. But yeah, there's a lot of directions to go though.
Dr. Kelton, I have a question regarding something you mentioned in the film, being in the fight you stage. Are you still in that stage? And if so, I mean, I can imagine that's got to be extremely challenging. I'm curious to know, and you've touched on this previously, but what keeps you going and how are you fighting back, so to speak?
Look, I think that with COVID, the arrival of COVID in March of 2020, the not only national but international conversation changed, but surely the national conversation changed because, Congress did a $2.2 trillion fiscal package called the CARES Act without really a moment's hesitation, no hand wringing about deficits or whether it would, that it would increase the debt. Nothing about going to China. How are you going to pay for it? All of that was just vanquished. And Congress just sat down, banged out a piece of legislation, drafted it, committed the resources. You're going to get a check. You're going to get a check. You're going to beef up unemployment benefits. People are going to get $600 a week from the federal government. This and this and this. And it's a set of instructions. They found the votes. They passed it. The money goes out. And immediately, the headlines around the country were things like, we're all MMTers now, Bloomberg, New York Times, the Washington Post, on and on. Chris Hayes out there tweeting at me, you won, you really won. Well, okay, that's the final stage, right? Then you win. So in a sense, there was a big profile of me in the New York Times, something about, is this what winning looks like in a victory lap and all that sort of stuff. Now, we're back in the fight you stage, big time with this film, because, economists don't want to rewrite their lecture notes. And maybe a lot of teachers don't either. But, you've been teaching certain things for a very long period of time. This group comes in and challenges core assumptions about how a lot of this stuff works. And that's not always a welcome thing when you're, in the mainstream, to have your ideas challenged. And so your natural instinct is to defend what you have embraced, right? The ideas that you've embraced, not to just welcome the newcomers and say, oh, wasn't I silly? You're right, you know? So I think the emergence of inflation definitely allowed some people to, I think, misinterpret MMT as somehow leading us down a bad path and delivering inflation, when really what we said all along is you can't run out of money, but you can run out of things to buy. And we all watch supply chains become brittle and break, and backlogs and shipping. And it was about the supply side of the economy. This administration has responded with, you know, Chips and Science Act and infrastructure and home and nearshoring and French, all these things to double down, to redouble our efforts around supply and capacity. Janet Yellen described the Biden administration's economic framework as modern supply side economics. That's how she described it. And as soon as she did, a former member of the Trump administration said, oh my God, she's talking about MMT. And she didn't call it MMT, she called it modern supply, but the principle is the same, right? Focusing on supply constraints and dealing with that to relieve inflationary pressure. So we're kind of in a 1 foot in the winning and 1 foot back in the fighting, I think, today. Okay. And so what keeps me going is I want both feet in the same.
I have, Maren, I have just one more question for you before I start looking at some audience submitted questions. And this is probably something many out there in the audience today are curious about. But as a first-time director of a documentary, what advice do you have to those who might be planning or, you know, have ambitions to direct their first documentary film?
Oh God.
Don't say, don't do it.
Well, I will.
I know.
When I was told by my mentor, don't do it, and I didn't listen. And every day I thought I should have listened to her. So I don't know. The documentary market is in a really hard place. I mean, it's hard to say go for it, like you can do it, because it's not at all easy. I'm sorry. It's just there's a lot of content out there. There's a lot, the market is very difficult over the last 2 years, has really, you know, made it very difficult to sell films, to monetize films. So unless you have the funding put together from the beginning and you can pay yourself from the beginning, I really encourage that, because you don't want to count on it coming later. So I would just be realistic, temper expectations. It's not an easy road. You have to be pretty obsessed with the subject and not really, intending to get a living wage. I don't know if that's what you're into.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of take a look at some questions. And again, one of the questions which I kind of touched on earlier was what was the major motivation to create this documentary? I know we kind of talked about this earlier, but if you could, I guess, describe the motivation in like one sentence, what would it be?
Again, I think just eventually just wanting to understand, you know, I came at it from climate, but wanting to understand how our monetary system actually works, I guess, at this point, so that then to understand what as a society we actually have the capacity to do.
Another question we have here is, what's the incentive for government to accept the premise of MMT and use it to alleviate the plight of ordinary citizens?
What's the premise for the government to accept?
Or the incentive.
Incentive.
If they want to help their people or not. That's it.
Well, I mean, look, the thing is, go back to, I'll tell you a story. So I'm in Washington, D.C. The Republicans just passed the 2017 tax cuts. They've just done it. I'm in D.C. for an event. I have Senator Sanders scheduled to speak at the event. I hadn't seen him in quite a while. So I walk out. I understand he had just arrived. So I go out into the welcoming lobby area to greet him and bring him to the podium. He storms in. He looks at me and he says, "Is this you? Did you do this? Did you do this?" See, there's a tendency for some people to think that anything that increases the deficit is MMT. That's not MMT. It might be perfectly consistent with principles of MMT to try to reduce the deficit or even achieve a surplus. Running deficits or bigger deficits is not evidence that someone has embraced or is carrying out or implementing MMT. Not at all. It's not the budget outcome that matters. It's real outcomes. The goal is to achieve broad balance in the economy, high employment, full employment, and low inflation. Those are the economic goals. The number that falls out of the budget box at the end of the year, irrelevant. And maybe you can achieve those goals with a balanced budget, fine. Maybe you can do it with a small surplus, great. Maybe it takes 6% deficit to GDP, which is what we have today. If that's what it takes to achieve full employment and price stability, the inflation goals, I don't care what number pops out of the budget box. But there's this idea that, embracing MMT means adopting certain kinds of fiscal policies. It doesn't. So every time, Republicans do tax cuts, people say, well, there it is. That's evidence they don't care about the deficit. Well, I agree with that. But MMTers care about it. We care, right? Every deficit is good for someone. The question is for whom and for what are you using those deficits to achieve, right? So I think the incentive should be that they can take fuller advantage of the power of the purse to deliver on what we might call the public purpose, policies and programs that are in the service of the people, that do the most for the largest group to elevate well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, it's just a there is a common question, like, how do we implement MMT or, something like that. And so again, we try to shift that framing to MMT is just trying to accurately describe the monetary system we already have today in the US and in other currency issuing countries like the UK, Canada, Japan, China, and Mexico. There's a long list of countries that issue their own currencies. And so it's just, it's not a matter of changing any of that plumbing necessarily, but just having the accurate understanding enables us to maybe more accurately understand what we want to prioritize, but that always comes down to budgets, to priorities and to politics. So if your politics, if your people want to prioritize war and destruction, this is how you carry it out. If you want to prioritize a more sustainable future, this is how you carry it out. This is how the monetary system works, but then it's totally up to democracies and societies to decide how they want to utilize their resources towards what outcome.
Yeah. And would you say that's where like ordinary citizens have a role here to kind of, use their vote to also kind of further this as well, like further this change? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's where a lot of the education becomes really important, because you can't have what you can't see, and you can't see what you might have unless somebody has revealed to you what the real constraints are, what the real limits. Otherwise, you're just going to believe every politician who pats their pant pockets and says, I'd love to help, but we have these deficits. There's no money. There's no, yeah.
Yeah, I think we just have to have that broader, understanding so that you can vote more and, be a more informed voter and not be told like, we can't do this, so don't even think about it. Don't bother to vote for healthcare for all, or because you just told from the get-go, it's impossible. Don't even envision a better future. And this, I think, at least enables us and empowers us to envision that better future. And then if we're creative enough, we can find a way to get there. So it hopefully opens us up to a wider, more positive vision if we want.
There was a question in the chat, and it's from an anonymous person, but it is MMT a lens, a theory, or just a description of what reality is?
I think it's all of those things. As every school of thought in economics is, whether it's the Austrian school, the Keynesian school, the monetarist school, the new classical school. It's the beauty of macroeconomics, is like a cheesecake factory menu. There's like so much to choose from. You just keep flipping the pages. And so all schools of thought have both theoretical and descriptive. Milton Friedman was a theorist, the quantity theory of money, he famously revived, and the Phillips curve with expectations, inflation added to the Phillips curve. Those are all theoretical propositions. And then from that theoretical framework that he put forward, he advocated things like a monetary growth rule. So that's a policy prescription that complements his descriptive framework. So I think it's true for every school of thought that you will have some theoretical apparatus, some effort to describe how the banking system or the monetary system or the economy or consumption or investment, like how do these things work? You have theory to explain. And then usually you have some kind of prescriptive preferences that go along with that. Like governments should try to shift this curve so that your economy operates at full employment or something like that. That's, I think, common to all.
But you would hope that some would be verified more by the laws that are actually written, and we could actually check with the Fed and the Treasury how the operations occur to
Like the Phillips
verify.
curve. The Phillips curve has been famously, put on trial on and off again for decades. And you go through periods of time where Jerome Powell will say, yeah, it's broken, it doesn't work. Everybody puts the data down. There's no downward, there's no inverse trade-off. And people say, well, I guess the Phillips curve should be thrown in the trash heap, loanable funds theory. You got to interrogate, how do banks really make loans? Do they really lend other people's money, or does does banking work differently? So
there are theories, but then are they backed up by the empirical evidence? Empirical evidence, but also the laws that are actually written.
And how institutions function, and
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So one question that we had is, how does the debt ceiling play a role in the framework of MMT?
well, doesn't, I don't think necessarily play a role in the framework, but we can understand the debt ceiling as a self-imposed constraint. Ironically, when the debt ceiling was initially introduced, it was to give Treasury more latitude so that Congress didn't have to be so involved in the day-to-day decisions about which maturity, whether to do T-bills or more 5-year or more 10-year notes. It was World War I. They were just like, this is getting really complicated. Let's just put an upper limit in place with tons of headroom so Treasury can just make these decisions and Congress doesn't have to be involved. So ironically, the introduction of the debt ceiling, which was to give more flexibility, has become this constraining institution, a self-imposed constraint, which forces Congress to periodically come back and raise their hand and say, okay, we'll give you the headroom that you need to continue clearing payments the way you customarily do, which involves issuing treasuries. So it doesn't play a role in MMT per se, except to say that we can understand it as an unnecessary, self-imposed constraint that doesn't actually serve to constrain spending or anything else. It's really just something that's been weaponized for political purposes.
Okay. And then another question we had in the chat was, how is MMT related to Keynesian economics?
Well, that's a big question. How much time? We can do long answers and lectures on this. So it depends on what you mean by Keynesian. Of course, there are people like, Paul Krugman or somebody like that who views himself as a Keynesian. We would say like a new Keynesian, very wedded to ISLM models and playing with tools like that. That's not the kind of Keynesianism that MMTers leaned into. If we leaned into any Keynes, and we did, it was John Maynard Keynes and the original writings of Keynes. So like the general theory or how to pay for the war or some of these things that are even featured in the film.
Yeah.
So the theory of effective demand. Why do capitalist economies, why do market economies tend to operate chronically with too little demand, with unemployment, involuntary unemployment? Keynes's answer was a lack of effective demand. We accept that as the root cause of unemployment is a lack of effective demand. That's compatible with MMT. liquidity. I mean, I could go on and on. Keynes's theory of investment liquidity. I think most of us take many of those tenets of the true John Maynard Keynes kind of into our framework, but we don't stop there.
Okay, and it looks like that we're almost out of time, but Josh, was there any other questions that you saw that you would like to ask?
Yeah, right now, actually, I mean, there was one question I think that keeps coming up about instructors not wanting to change their lectures or really pivot their plans or curriculum. So I'm curious, how would you, either of you, really like to challenge faculty, department heads, maybe just students of economic theory? How would you like to challenge them now with this film and really maybe lay down the gauntlet for them?
Well, I'll give you two quick stories because this is really inspirational for me. And this happens to me all the time. I hear from, people who teach AP Econ. I hear from students who take Econ in high school and sometimes even younger. But just since we've been here screening the show in New York, first night that we were here, I had a high school junior come up to me with his dad. The dad read my book, passed the book on to his son. The son read the book and brought his copy of the book with him. They came from North Carolina to see the film in New York City because this boy wanted to get his book signed. He wanted to see the film. And he convinced his AP Econ teacher to allow him to write his final paper on 3 of the deficit myths. Now, it's not part of the curriculum, AP Econ curriculum, but apparently this teacher is so terrific that she encouraged him to explore these ideas because he was clearly very passionate about them. So he had me sign one autograph for him in the book and one for her. And then he wrote to me to follow up. The next night, another boy came in, senior in high school, also with his dad. He's just committed to Columbia, so he's going to be a freshman with my son here before too long. But he came in, he read the book, and then passed the book to his dad. So what I'm saying is these kids will discover this stuff on their own and just eat it up. Their minds are so open and they're so hungry for something that connects with them, that they view as someone really trying to help me understand. It feels genuine, it feels honest. It's not a bunch of abstractions in the form of, supply and demand curves smattered all over a page or something. So I think if teachers can get a sense of how effective and thankful their students will be when they have an opportunity to explore things from different angles, that it's worth, rewriting a lecture or two to be able to introduce some of these things.
And hopefully there could be some curriculum available to share,
Yeah.
like maybe some modern money. I've heard ramblings of, working on curriculum that could be on the undergrad level or even high school level.
Mhm.
So maybe some of that will be available.
Yeah, the easier we make it, the easier anybody makes it to introduce new concepts by supplying maybe a set of PowerPoints or some lecture notes or both, or some practice quizzes, anything that you can do to help teachers who are already very overburdened
Yeah.
in their jobs.
So as soon as we have that, we'll send that to Kanopy, or it'll be on the Finding
Sure.
Money website. We'll let you know. But yeah, I think that'll be really helpful because then, once you change some of that university level curriculum, or even teaching it as a contending perspective to start with, teach the mainstream, teach MMT side by side and say, these are the actual differences. What do you think? What do you think has more empirical evidence behind it? I mean, that could be a good way to start out that teaching and that evolution. And then that'll go down to the high school level. That's obviously preparing them through their AP tests for college. So yeah, it'll be interesting.
Once you have those materials, we definitely love to distribute it in our network. We have tons of channels for that. So please, anytime you have something, let us know. But yeah, David, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
I think that is all I had.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I know that we will be sending off a recording of this either the next couple of days or next week. So thank you again for joining us for this discussion for Finding the Money on Kanopy. If you have any other further questions, You can reach out to canopy.com/contact and reach us about the film. But I'll, for now, just say thank you so much, Marin. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelton. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today and having a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you.